Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekly reading report. Yes, it's time for my weekly reading report, that fantastic program where I talk about all the stuff that I read during the previous week. And I did read some stuff, Roger. I read some stuff. So let's talk about that stuff. I will break out my lists for the 500 book challenge, the ever ongoing challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I'll buy any new ones. And where am I starting today? I'm starting with book 231. Book 231, which is this book, which I started and I talked about last week. This is The Spirit by Will Eisner. This is the best of The Spirit by Will Eisner. So I finished the rest of the stories that were in this book. And this book is fantastic. It's wonderful. It's everything everybody has ever said it was by Will Eisner. It's just fantastic. So, The Spirit, with just magnificent artwork by Eisner. Great stories. This was a long-running newspaper insert comic strip. And Eisner just did some brilliant work. Crime stories mostly, but also full of all kinds of other weird stuff. Aliens and all kinds of other things are in this strip. Pretty much everything Eisner felt like doing, he did, I think. On The Spirit, with The Spirit right there, who usually he's usually not the main character in the stories. These stories are usually about other people, and the Spirit's kind of in there. But this is a sampling of the Spirit, and these are the only Spirit stories I've ever read, because when I was growing up reading comic books, I could never find the Spirit. There were reprints, but I could never find those reprints. So finally I was able to read some Spirit stories, and I was suitably impressed. I will do an Epic Comic Book Wednesday on this book and on this character soon. Not this Wednesday. I'm doing something else this Wednesday, but soon I'll be talking about the Spirit. So that was book 231, and it was fantastic. It was fantastic. So that was the Spirit. Next, we are at book 232. 232, which was The Lone Ranger by not Fran Stryker. It says it was Fran Stryker, but apparently it was Gaylord Dubois. And it was published under Fran Stryker's name here in this paperback edition. Fran Stryker was a big part of the Lone Ranger radio show. He wrote thousands of Lone Ranger radio shows, apparently. And he wrote, I think, the other Lone Ranger novels in the series. And they were all reprinted back in the 1970s in these cool paperbacks. And I got them because my good friend Steve Donahue found them in the Brattle bookshop and sent them my way. So I read this first one by Gaylord Dubois, who wrote a ton of stuff. He wrote a ton of stuff, a lot of comic books, a lot of Tarzan comic books, among other things. And he did an excellent job on this novel. This is a good book. I was happy with this one. It's a decent Western that kept me engaged the whole way through. The Lone Ranger was a figure of mystery in this. He was there all over the book, but you never really learn anything about the Lone Ranger in this. Interestingly, we learn a lot about Silver, his horse. We get Silver's origin story, and this is Silver's first adventure. And Silver is a very impressive horse in this book. We get a little bit of Tonto, but not as much as I would have thought we would have gotten. But Tonto's in this as well. His best friend, Tonto. And I think Tonto's the only guy who knows who the Lone Ranger really is. But yeah, he's in there, but not as much as I would have thought. But it's an excellent book. If you ever see it lying around, pick it up and read it, because it's a really good Western. Very suitable for June on the Range, but I've got lots of other Lone Ranger books to read, thanks to Steve. This was soon to be an international film spectacular, which was not spectacular at all. There are a couple Lone Ranger movies that, weren't so good. That was one of them. And then there was that last one, which is like, so The Lone Ranger. He was really good in the television show and the radio show and these books. So there you go. The Lone Ranger. That was awesome. I read that. That was book 232. And then the last book I finished, I read other stuff, but the last book I finished was book 233, which is this book, Block and Bradbury. Block and Bradbury. So this is a collection of stories from Robert Block and Ray Bradbury. And they're just in here in the same book with this very peculiar explosion cover. I guess I don't know what's going on in this cover. I got this book from the great David Wiley. David Wiley, who has a BookTube channel. He hasn't done much for a while, but his channel's great, so I'll link it down below. And he had this book and he sent it to me, which was very kind. And it's an excellent book. It's interesting. So this on the back, it says, the best from Block and Bradbury. It is not. This is not a book of the best of Robert Block and Ray Bradbury. But the stories in here are fun. They're good stories. They're all horror stories. So on the cover, it says, the two finest writers of sci-fi. I hope the Outlaw bookseller never saw this book because he'd be offended right there. The two finest writers of sci-fi and horror team up to give you this fantastic, frightening, fabulous book. It's fantastic, frightening, and fabulous, all in one. And on the title page, it says, 10 masterpieces of science fiction by Ray Bradbury and Robert Block. So these are all horror stories, and these are early horror stories, I believe. All the Ray Bradbury in here is from the 1940s, and I believe the Robert Block is probably from the 40s and probably the 50s at the latest, although it doesn't say when the Block stories were written. This volume is mostly Robert Block, with a few stories by Ray Bradbury. So Block gets most of the page count in here. It's odd that they put these two together for this book. It's an interesting combination, but I love both these writers, so I was happy, and it gave me a chance to read some of these old pulp stories from Robert Block, and a couple of them I hadn't read, including the very first the very first story in here is a story called The Shadow from the Steeple by Robert Block, which is a story I've heard about, but never had a chance to read, and it's a sequel to H.P. Lovecraft's The Haunter of the Dark. So that was cool. And Lovecraft takes part in the story. So it was fun. All these stories were good. They were good, pulpy horror stories. The Ray Bradbury stories, even though there were fewer of them, were better than the Robert Block stories. I mean, even though they're not the best Ray Bradbury stories, they're good. They definitely were creepier than the Block stories. Although the Robert Block stories were fun. Everything in this book is fun. Again, a book if you ever see lying around, pick it up. From Tower. It's a big T science fiction book with no science fiction in it. But that's okay. It's awesome. A lot of typos I've noticed, and I don't know if that's just a thing that happened with Tower books. But had a fair number of typos, but that's okay. It was still awesome. So Block and Bradbury, this was tremendous fun. I was glad to read that. And that's everything I finished this week. Although I did read some other things. Let me shuffle stuff around here. So I started early. This is the last day of the month, huh? Yeah. This is the last day of March. So I started early on Roger's pick for April for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, which is The Jewel of the Seven Stars, which I'm reading in this. The Jewel of the Seven Stars. I'm right here on that chapter. And, it's pretty good so far. It's like starts off as a mystery story. We don't know what the mystery is. Some guy who's really interested in Egyptology and artifacts from ancient Egypt has been injured and has been rendered unconscious, and he won't wake up, and his daughter, of course, is very concerned, and nobody knows who tried to attack this guy. And so his daughter calls in her friend who is a lawyer, and we also have the police come in, and so we have various characters come in to try to figure out what's going on and solve the mystery. It has a very Dracula feel in that we have a character who's in a sick room and other people trying to figure out what's going on with this character. Although in Dracula, we all knew it was Dracula. And in this book, I've never read this story before, as it turns out. So I don't know what's going on, and I don't know how this story is going to resolve itself. So we'll see. But it's entertaining. I have to give it that. You know, Bram Stoker gets the bad rap of only writing one good book, Dracula. Although, as I've said many times before, including last week when I talked about this, Dracula's Guest and Other Stories is a fantastic collection of short stories. So that was another good book that Bram Stoker did. But this one so far is not bad. So Jewel of the Seven Stars so far is not bad. I don't know how it's going to turn out. And so it might suck in the end, or it might just be kind of lame. Who knows? I will let you know when I'm finished with it. I will hopefully finish with it this week, I think. You know, unless I get caught up in other things, but probably. So yeah, Jewel of the Seven Stars. So far, so good. So I'm reading that right now. And I've been reading some other things, including a little bit of this. This is G.I. Joe. This is the G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, Compendium 1. Compendium 1. So a friend of the channel emailed me and said, hey, I have a comic book that I think you'd like, and I never hear you talk about it, so I'm going to send it to you. Will you read it? And I said, sure. Send me the comic. And he sent me this. He sent me this. So, of course, I'm aware of G.I. Joe. You know, when I was a kid, I had the big G.I. Joe, you know, with the Foot Locker and everything. But then they made the little G.I. Joes and the cartoon and all that stuff. And I remember all that stuff. And I remember when the G.I. Joe comic book was being released from Marvel Comics. And I never bought it because it was a comic book about a toy. I mean, how good could it be? And apparently a lot of Marvel writers felt the same way, because apparently, as the story goes, every Marvel writer at Marvel said no to G.I. Joe, except Larry Hama, who was a Vietnam veteran and took this comic book and saw it as an opportunity to do some interesting things. So I didn't know anything about G.I. Joe really until I started reading this. And then I looked into it a little bit because this comic book is actually good. I was really surprised. So there is the iconic first issue of G.I. Joe from Marvel. And I noticed going through these early issues that you have a lot of Marvel second stringers on art. Like it looks like Mike Vosberg takes over the art in a little bit. The first issue is by Herb Trimpe, who was definitely a second stringer by the time this came out. And we get some other artists in here, like Don Perlin, you know. And so the first issue by Herb Trimpe, the artwork is actually pretty good. You know, Trimpe is one of those guys who can be absolutely terrible. He did an issue of Thor, a fill-in issue of Thor, which is not the worst Thor story I've ever read, but the artwork was almost the worst that I've ever seen on a Thor story. Just because I think he was either rushed or didn't care. I don't know. But Herb Trimpe could be like that. You know, everybody remembers him for the Hulk, which is a comic book he really liked. And so, you know, he did decent work on the Hulk. But he could be terrible. He could be absolutely terrible. He is not terrible in this. So I think he must have liked G.I. Joe because he does a decent job. I was happy to see that. And of course, he did that iconic cover. And it was fun. This is a fun issue. And it was way, way better than I expected it to be. This is way better than a comic book about toys has any right to be. And there was this one part where Hawk is talking to his soldiers before they go on his mission. And he says this, which kind of caught me by surprise, made me think, this comic book's going to be different than I thought it would be. He says, we're soldiers. Our job is to do the unthinkable and be forgotten. And I thought, that's interesting. That's an interesting line to find in a comic book about, based on toys. And apparently Marvel, I found out in an email later that Marvel actually edited that out and replaced it with something stupid. But for this, they put that line back in as Larry Hama originally wrote it. And yeah, I read the first 3 issues of this. I've got plenty more to go. I think there are 50 in here. And I was suitably impressed. So I'm hooked on G.I. Joe, and I will continue with this series because it's fun. And really kind of, there's more going on here than I thought I would find in a comic book called G.I. Joe. So there's that. I'm reading that. I'm also reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four. Every issue from that initial run, which ran from 1961 to 1996. And I'm a little behind where I want to be, but I'm going to catch up to where I want to be. So I'm at 246, where Doctor Doom makes his return. Doctor Doom makes his return, and he's here to take over Latveria once again because he was kicked out. And apparently the Latverians can't survive without fascism. So Doctor Doom is back, and he's got the Fantastic Four with him. And due to a drug that he's using on the Fantastic Four to zap their will, he's going to try to get them to help him take Latveria back over. So we'll see. This has been a magnificent run from John Byrne. I've loved it so far. So we'll see how that story is. I'll talk more about that next week. And what else have I been reading? I've also been reading this kind of slowly. I'm reading the Silver Age Justice League, every issue of the Silver Age Justice League. This is Silver Age Justice League Omnibus Volume 2. And I am right there, so I'm almost finished with it. I just have to spend some more time reading this instead of other things. That's a thing, about reading multiple things. Everything you read, that's one thing that you're not reading. But it's been a ton of fun. This comic book is a ton of fun. And so all of these 1960s stories by Gardner Fox. So I just read this one, Man, Thy Name is Brother, which is all about how prejudice sucks. Justice League, so woke. And it's a little heavy-handed, but it's the 1960s. And, it's a story about how prejudice sucks. So, I'm for that. This was okay. It was a good story for that kind of thing. And now the next story is from issue 59. This is the next one I have to read. The Justice League in Trouble Again. In Trouble Again, the Justice League. So these stories have been a ton of fun. All these old Gardner Fox stories. I'm coming to the end of Gardner Fox's run on the Justice League. But it's been something. And the art is still by Mike Sikowski, which a lot of people don't like him and say bad things about him, but I like him. I've grown to like Sikowski. This has been a fun comic, and I've had a good time with it. So there's that. And I think that's everything. Roger. Yeah, okay. That's everything for this week. I will hopefully finish Jewel of the Seven Stars, and I'll be able to tell you more about that Bram Stoker classic next week. And who knows what else I'll read. I'll talk about it next time. Okay, guys, I will catch you then.